Well, hello and welcome back for the last and fourth session of the day. We shall now focus on the future of responsible brain research against the background of the experiences and the knowledge we have gained throughout the years. How can we ensure that we get an even more responsible brain research? And how can we integrate the diverse academic fields that need to be involved? Neuroscience, AI, ethics, philosophy, social science, and public engagement. We have a panel of 5 prominent panelists, but before I introduce them, I would like to ask the audience again to please prepare your questions whilst you listen to the presentations and the discussion. So I will begin by introducing the panelists, and I will ask a short question to each of them and ask them to please kindly respond, but in 5 minutes maximum. Again, we have a tight schedule, as much as we would like to go on for much longer, but we need to respect it. So in the panel, we have Judy, who is Professor of Neurology, Distinguished University Scholar and UBC Distinguished Professor in Neuroethics, Chair of the International Brain Initiative. Caroline Montojo, who is Director of the Dana Foundation. Laura Cabrera, who is a Dorothy Fur Huck and Lloyd Huck Chair in Neuroethics, Associate Professor of Engineering, Science and Mechanics and of Philosophy, and Senior Research Associate, Rock Ethics Institute. And she is also the chair of the IEEE Brain Neuroethics Subcommittee. We have Nikolaos Kastrinos, who is team leader Foresight, DG Research and Innovation of the European Commission. And last but not least, Pavel Svoboda, who is CEO of Ebrains and the Director General of the Human Brain Project. I wish you all a very warm welcome to this session, and thank you very much for participating, not least those of you who have actually had to get up very early in the morning in order to attend. A special thanks to you. So, Judy, drawing on your experience and your career in neuroethics, how do you see the need and opportunities for more responsible neuroethics? And what do you think is the most important aspects that we need to think about today? Could you summarize that in a few minutes?
I'd be happy to do that, Kathinka. Thank you so much to all of you for having us here in this panel this morning, and good morning from a still very, very dark Vancouver, British Columbia. If I may begin, it's customary in Canada to acknowledge the lands from which I'm speaking, and those are the lands of the Musqueam, Lillooet, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations people, and I'm very privileged to be here joining you this morning on their beautiful territories. I'll answer your question, Kathinka, wearing 2 hats, and I'll try to be brief. The first hat, of course, is a career-long commitment to responsible innovation in neuroscience, specifically with neurotechnology, but really more broadly spanning the full continuum of R&D from cells to systems. And indeed wearing my new hat as the new chair of the International Brain Initiative. And perhaps I could answer your question in 4 points that I've thought about in advance, knowing what to anticipate in this conversation. And I'm sure my colleagues will speak also to some of these ethical issues and some more technical issues. But perhaps to encapsulate my answer, my comments, it's under an overarching theme of local engagement and global reciprocity. So as everyone in this conference knows, the neuroethics train left the station at high speed in 2001. We've been devoted to responsible innovation, the mission of responsible innovation, since the formalization of the field. And I think my first message, my first point of the 4 is that we must, as we look to the future of neuroscience, always remember to look back and build on the shoulders of others who have preceded us, whether they're in the neuroscience field, bioethics, law, and so forth. There's an importance of efficiencies and respect that I think accrue benefits to all that we do in looking forward. My second message actually very much relates to some of the discourse that Professor Yanka just shared with us around the OECD meeting on responsible innovation. I think the gathering of so many people and from so many nations in that city at that time in 2018 showed that there really is a global commitment to responsible innovation in neurotechnology and neuroscience more broadly. But I will say that I think, and this bears on my theme, that the approach has to, the strategies and efforts have to occur locally with attention to local cultures, the socio-political climate, and the local research environment. And that local uptake is really essential for public trust, for funding and relevant policy making, and then ultimately global reciprocity. And that without it, global engagement will be thin and I think unsustainable. And this is where the International Brain Initiative comes in. And of course, Carolyn Montojo was a force in bringing the IBI to life when she was at the Kavli Foundation. We are now, I'm just going to say, on fire, forging ahead with our initiatives under my leadership and that of Tony Hanan in Australia. And we're unpacking the challenges of frontiers in neuroscience through dedicated working groups. Some have been active for more than 5 years, and some new ones are coming online now. So for example, we're looking to refresh, and we are refreshing the Neuroethics working group. It will be undertaken under the leadership of Dr. Kathinka. And our goal is to fill gaps that are unfilled or barely touched by neuroethics to date. For example, disruptive neuroethics, economic impact neuroethics, gender and diversity. And there are a number of other working groups under the IBI, technology, data standards and sharing, training and education that are all essential to advancing and supporting responsible innovation in neuroscience more broadly. Some new groups that we're looking at are emotional brain mapping, and also cross-cultural perspectives. And I want to say to this audience that we are looking for new ideas for working groups at this time and are very receptive to all your ideas. Third message is that we have, as scholars and scientists in ethics and for neuroscience, I think have an obligation to offer evidence and provide support to neuroscience, but also mitigate hype that sometimes surrounds the ethical space. I think this is becoming actually an increasingly acute problem as news media and journalistic media are focusing more and more on topics like mind reading, mind control, neuro rights, and the like. I think the excitement around the future of these technologies in neuroscience is phenomenal. But I fear, and I have expressed this through other groups that I've served with and provided advisory to, including JESDA in Switzerland, that we cannot detract or deter our critical attention to the burden of neurologic and neuropsychiatric disease and sacrifice that for excitement or hype around mind control and mind modulation. We have to focus on people who are still suffering, who are facing the ravages of climate change and war, food insecurity. And once we have achieved just access, perhaps not to all people, but to far more people than we serve today, then we can devote more and more attention to futuristic ambitions. And my final point—
very important. Thank you, Judy. I'm sorry, we do need to
No
change
problem.
the timing. But thank you very, very much for those impressive statements and points. So moving to our next panelist, Caroline, you are president of the Dana Foundation, and you have driven a new focus area on neuroethics and society. So how do you conceive the most important lessons from the past, and what roads would you recommend for the future?
Yes, thank you very much, Kathinka, for that question, and also to the Human Brain Project the Danish Board of Technology for this invitation to serve on this panel today. I've had the pleasure of working with both DBT and HBP and some of the past work Judy mentioned with the International Brain Initiative, which she now chairs, and also the Global Neuroethics Summit. And so it's really wonderful to speak on this topic. For those not familiar with the Dana Foundation, I'll just share a word about who we are and where we come from. We are a private philanthropic organization based in New York City, founded in 1950. And I joined the Dana Foundation as president and CEO about a year and a half ago to establish a forward-looking mission and organization for the foundation. And so this prompt that you provide about what advances we need to develop responsible brain science is especially important to us because our mission was established to support responsible brain science. And so more specifically, our vision at the Dana Science is brain science for a better future. And we embark on this with a recognition that science can produce both salutary as well as negative effects on human well-being and flourishing. And so after a great deal of stakeholder engagement and consultation, we've defined our future mission and seeing neuroscience that benefits society and reflects the aspirations of all people. And so to Judy's point about local community engagement being so critical. And so to the prompt, I believe that the three most important advances that the field needs are to develop education, training, as well as public engagement on neuroscience and society issues. And to the question on how these steps can be taken, our three programmatic pillars at the Dana Foundation were designed to try to help make some additional movement on these three areas of education, training, and public engagement. And so I'll just share briefly, given the time constraint, about these three programmatic pillars and how we see ourselves moving forward on these, and also with a note that it's really going to take many different stakeholders to move forward on these. We see ourselves as catalysts, and we often look for partners. We always look for partners where we can leverage resources to help raise the tide on demonstrating the value of incorporating neuroethics into the neuroscience enterprise. So regarding the three areas that I mentioned, education, training, and public engagement, one of our pillars at the Dana Foundation is called Dana Education. And this builds on our past work to inspire and support education around neuroscience and how it interfaces with our everyday lives, really capturing those young minds. Brain Awareness Week is our signature campaign underneath that pillar. It has global reach through both EBRO, the International Brain Research Organization, and the Federation of European Neuroscience Societies. So we continue on that path, which has been really the roots of the foundation. And then we also move forward with two pillars that are new and focus on these other next generation frontier aspects of neuroscience. One of them is called the Dana Next Gen program. And here I think it really speaks to some of the earlier panel discussions on the importance of interdisciplinarity. Because the goal of this pillar is to develop a next generation of interdisciplinary leaders, thought leaders, who shepherd neuroscience for a better world. And last year, I'm excited to announce we just set forth our first call for proposals in our neuroscience and society area, and it was 4 Dana centers in neuroscience and society that would help to catalyze some of this interdisciplinary work, because we do know in the academic sector how difficult it can be to overcome some of the departmental silos that allow that kind of interdisciplinary research to take place. So that's one of our programs that we've just launched under that pillar. And then the final pillar is called the Dana Frontiers pillar. And this one, the goal here is to grow capacity for informed public reflection on emerging neuroscience and neurotechnology. And so what we hope to do here is to catalyze new models for bidirectional or multi-directional public engagement on some of these pressing issues in neuroscience that carry with them very heavy ethical or societal implications. Many of them were just mentioned today by Marcello, thinking about BCIs, the intersection of AI and BCIs. Judy had mentioned the importance of thinking about neurological and psychiatric disorders. I think there's a great deal of deeper multi-directional public engagement that could be done in these areas to bring science and society closer. So I'll stop there, Kathinka. Thank you for this opportunity to speak on these topics, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you very much for your wonderful input. I'm sure there will be a lively discussion after this. So may I now turn to Laura, drawing on your experience of neuroethics in IEEE, how do you conceive what would be the most important perspectives to think about if we are going towards a future of even more responsible brain research?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again for the kind invitation. And it's a pleasure to be serving in this panel again. So I started working with IEEE Brain as an opportunity to really engage a group of stakeholders that historically, at least in my mind, has had little involvement with the neuroethics work compared to other professions. So IEEE is an Institute for Electronic and Electronical Engineers, and it's the world's largest technical professional organization that is dedicated to advancing technology for the benefit of humanity. It's a huge organization, and just one part of it is IEEE Brain, which emerged after the big brain initiatives. And we have been focusing on different aspects related to neuroscience and neurotechnology. And me sharing the neuroethics subcommittee, one of the lessons that I've seen there is how much need there was to involve engineers in this type of discussions. So perhaps in other countries they've been more successful, but certainly at least in the spheres that I've moved, I have seen that as a key need. And I think we've been trying to engage engineers in these discussions, as well as just echoing what Judy and Caroline already mentioned, the public discussion, the public, right? There's many different publics, and again, we always have to keep that in mind, and that's a critical step for just continuing the responsible development of brain science and neurotechnology. The other key aspect that I see that we've been touching throughout this event is the aspect of culture and how to address cultural differences. And I think Dr. Illes really nicely captured that, okay, of course we need to focus local because that builds momentum to the national and international, but being mindful of these cultural differences at different, spheres, it's again key if we wanted to really develop responsible brain science and neurotechnology. And that also raises the question of social justice and equity. Again, we've been having these discussions and really talking with countries that have big brain initiatives and have the resources are the more pushing these technologies or these science. So, but how do we ensure that we don't leave behind those that are mostly consumers of neurotechnologies? And then finally, for me, what would be the most crucial step, consider where we find ourselves. We have heard, there's the Institute of Neuroethics, there is the INS, there is OECD guidelines. So how do we work together, right? Like how do we echoing again what Judy says, like look back, there's many things that we already done. How can we really leverage the momentum we have to really bring impact to the responsible brain science and neurotechnology? And so with that, again, how different organizations can collaborate and partner to ensure the implementation of guidelines and standards that exist, to co-create perhaps guidelines and standards for areas or for groups that remain untapped, and where focused guidance, where more focused guidance might be needed, and to create innovative ways to measure how these frameworks or guidance are transforming or not the responsible development in brain science and engineering. That's I am there.
Okay. Well, thank you very, very much for these perspectives, which I think complement beautifully what has been said so far. So may I now turn to Nikolaus. You're an expert in foresight analysis, and so with using foresight strategies and practices, how would you conceive from your perspective, what are the most important paths to follow and methods?
Okay, Thank you very, very much for the invitation. I'm honored to be here, and I'm humbled by the audience. I am neither a neuroethicist nor someone who is a specialist in responsible research and innovation, but responsibility has been a long-term concern of the foresight community, and so I thought I'd tell you a bit about foresight and responsibility, and then maybe say a couple of words about what we do that relates to neuroscience as foresight in the DG research of the Commission. And finally, if I have the time, my recipe for how I would organize foresight in the context of brain science. Starting from foresight and responsibility, our idea is that foresight brings responsibility. Simply, if you have foreseen something, be it a challenge, an opportunity, you carry the responsibility of your actions, whether you are prepared, your decisions, and so on. Yeah. This is the kind of responsibility that belongs to leadership. It's part of what we pay leaders for. And this responsibility, in fact, is very often the crux of the relationships between scientists and politicians, and whether and how it is said is a complicated question. So from this perspective, I find responsible research and innovation somewhat diagonal to my concerns. I understand that scientists should not be responsible in the objectives and conduct of the research, and therefore they should be sensitive to predictions about context, about ways in which the appreciations of their aims and practices can change in the future. And in that sense, foresight, scanning the context, very broadly, the context of your work, political, economic, social, science, technology, and what have you, for conversations about emerging futures is a useful practice. And this is the kind of foresight that we do. It's about conversations about emerging futures. And these conversations relate to people's wishes, hopes, and fears. They're very emotional and very imaginative. They're relatively poor in observation. There are little facts about the future. They very often involve reframing of evidence and data that actually makes them interesting and rewarding for a scientific endeavor in some way. Now, in our conversations, we have often come across the Human Brain Project, typically associated with a lot of hope for the future, medical, technological, educational, psychology, communication, and what have you. There's a great deal of positive expectations, which I know that the people in this conference understand much better than me. In our current round of foresight, we've been doing some foresight for the second strategic plan of Horizon Europe. We have put some effort in thinking about transhumanism and transhumanist aspirations, the sort of things that touch upon debates on authenticity, fairness, security, mental manipulation, things a lot of people worry about. What was very interesting was that in our project, there was little of that. The strongest critique that our transhumanist conversations were facing was that transhumanism is about developing more intimate relations between people and machines, whilst what we really need in the world is more intimate relations between people and nature. I understand that there is a strong political theme to that, but I found it very interesting. And the idea is that it's not only about regulating the environmental damage that could potentially be caused by AI governing huge electromechanical systems, but it can be about creating different forms of coexistence with other beings, forms of coexistence that create flourishing ecosystems rather than deserts of concrete, for example. And areas that keep popping up are plant and animal communications and the ways in which we understand and communicate with other beings. So I thought I'd tell you that. Other relevant spaces that we come across include the sick, healthy, enhanced space and how this is regulated in health systems, defense, security, dual use of enhancement technologies, and all these sort of things that I think the debate has been quite rich on. Now, how can you use foresight to enrich your deliberations about what are responsible and irresponsible objectives and modes of work? Well, I would start by scanning spaces like the ones I mentioned, ones that we know relate for signs of potential controversies. I would actually also dedicate some effort to scanning the world outside those spaces, knowing full well that this could be a very big and costly exercise. Then I would ask what kind of controversies these are and what kind of challenges and opportunities they may generate for brain research. And finally, I would ask, okay, now that we know this, what is the responsible thing to do and what would be irresponsible? This sort of deliberation can be internal to a community. You could do it in a research institute, in a research group, in a big project, and so on. Or you could invite people from very different communities. In Foresight, it is considered good practice to involve marginal communities and undesirable voices. It is actually a principle that you need to try and break the consensus. Does this work? And how would you know whether it works or not? Well, my experience is that it takes time.
A few last words, please.
But eventually, well, yes, my last words are these. It takes time, but people get it. And once they got it, they appreciate it. And in your case, I think it's important to see it not as an issue of compliance with ethical regulations, but rather as an ongoing deliberation about the future of the field. Ones that helps you avoid pitfalls and grasp opportunities. And the secret is perseverance and supportive leadership, one that understands its responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that sounds like quite a marvelous advice. Let's hope it's heeded. So turning now to Pavel. Now you are a leading figure in the creation of a more coherent policy of European brain research and a key player in this quest for a more responsible brain research. So what would your recommendations be in this area? How can we really secure a place for ethics and society in the future development of this?
Thank you very much, Kathinka, and thank you for having me today. Fascinating discussion. I would like to make 3 points in response to your question. One is about what we are committed to doing at Ebrains as the European brain science infrastructure. Second, about novel solutions needed to work with data and to test AI while putting RRI principles in practice. And the third is about both regulation, but also large brain science projects and programs going on. So let me go through this in telegraphic form. So Ebrains is a purpose-driven infrastructure. We deliver different digital brain research tools to scientists, but we're also guided by our ethics and society vision, which I will put in the chat the link to momentarily. And this vision states very clearly that Ebrains serves the scientific community by promoting the public good. So what this means is that we are deeply committed to ethical excellence, including the integration of ethical and social reflection in all our activities, in fact. And we aim to implement this by developing what we call an ethics infrastructure to support delivery of excellent science. We would also like to create a special service dedicated to supporting research teams in their endeavors. Finally, building on the HBP's work in this area, we aim to contribute to setting the benchmark internationally. I think a lot has been said about this today in the field. And in February, we are setting up for this purpose the Ebrains Ethics and Society Committee with a number of areas covered. So the second aspect I want to talk about has to do with putting ethics and ethical principles at the heart of designing new technologies. And this I find extremely important because we are in this area where working with sensitive data, and is at the heart of many developments. And also, we are in this period where neuroengineering solutions offer more and more promising results. So what we do about this is we are building a next generation, together with other partners, we are building a next generation clinical research infrastructure in a project called Ebrain Health. So this is focused on modeling and simulating complex neurobiological phenomena in a privacy-preserving fashion. And the tools and services developed as a result will help early digital in silico screening of new approaches. And this hopefully will also accelerate our new treatments. So that's one area. Another area has to do with facilities for testing and validation of innovation in artificial intelligence and robotics for healthcare. And that's also where we have instruments to help with ethics approval and certification for startups and companies active in this field. So these are examples of projects that really integrate data protection and ethics in the day-to-day practice of research and innovation. I think this link with the applied field is extremely important. And my third and last point is about regulation on the one hand, and these large research and innovation programs globally. As for the former, we heard in the previous session the case for a combined approach to AI and neuroethics. I find this very powerful and extremely important. In the European context, I believe the case can also be made for more specific guidelines when it comes to implementation of the medical device regulation with respect to neuro-related innovation. So we don't have such guidelines at the moment. Neuro devices are treated as medical devices. I think we would benefit from developing specific guidelines in this area. But as this is done, I think great opening is also needed for breakthrough technologies, because ethics is not only about avoidance of harm, it's also about doing good. And there are extremely promising results coming from neuroengineering approaches at the moment. And my final point has to do with large-scale programs in Europe.
Very briefly,
globally,
thank you.
And this will be very brief.
Very briefly, please, the last
point. In particular, the Future European Brain Health Partnership, which is the next big thing in Europe, needs to have a dimension related to ethics and social issues. And this should be part of the strategic research and innovation agenda that this partnership will develop. And ideally, an ethics charter should be part of this process. Thank you very much, Kathinka.
Thank you very much, Pavel, and thank you all of you for these important and very valuable observations. Now, before I'm opening the floor to the audience and questions from the audience, I would like to kindly invite each of you, if you have a comment, to use just exactly 1 minute to comment on the other observations from your fellow panelists, voluntarily, of course, if you have comments. Please. Judy?
Thank you, Kathinka. This is a fascinating conversation, and it brings me to the fourth point, which I wasn't able to make, but allows me to maybe pull all of our comments together, at least from one point of view, which is that I think we have an opportunity, if not an obligation, to decide and define what it is we deliver. Do we deliver guidelines? Do we deliver charters? I love that word. I haven't heard it before. Do we dare to deliver codes of ethics which imply criminality and enforceability? I think on the latter, codes of ethics are very dangerous. I don't think it's the space in which we should occupy, but rather provide the scaffolding and the infrastructure through frameworks, through charters, in looking to the future, and guide that way rather than with draconian or very prescriptive methods.
And if I may briefly comment that, AAAS had a meeting many years ago where precisely those issues were discussed. And there is a deep cultural difference between the US and Europe in how we evaluate those terms. such as an oath. We think of Cosa Nostra, and you think about the Hippocratic Oath. There are very interesting topics there. Thank you, Judy. Yes, Pavel?
Thank you very much. So it's good that you're asking us, Kathinka, because it's been such a fascinating exchange. I found what Nikos said about foresight extremely stimulating. And I already started to think how this could be taken further, because I think in our field it is all about foresight. Namely, now we are just at the beginning of revolutionary changes in how brain science is translated into neurotechnological applications. And there is that sort of one sentence in the OECD recommendation for responsible neurotech innovation, which speaks about the fact that neurotech holds a great promise for human health and innovation. That's all, of course, true, and we strongly believe in that. However, there's always the other side of the equation, and when and how we will need to have robust measures to distinguish between what serves human interests and what is there to do enhancement for other purposes. I think that's where foresight needs to come to our assistance. So developing neuro foresight, I think, is already my big takeaway from this discussion.
Thank you, Pavel. Any other panelists? Yes, please, Caroline.
Yes, thank you, Kathinka. I also was fascinated by the topic of foresight that Nikos mentioned. And as you were speaking about the reframing of evidence and data for those who participate in these foresight deliberations, I was also curious to hear your thoughts on how the goals of the foresight exercises are articulated to, for example, members of the public or patient groups who participate. And also curious to hear more about the reframing of evidence and data. So that was just something that I was really fascinated by from your comments, and would love to hear more to determine whether there are some aspects of that we can think about in the context of other cultures. Yeah.
Well, I will, of course, invite Nikolaus here. A tall order for a 1-minute response, but please make a heroic attempt.
Thanks. There are two things in my mind. One is the distance between the human brain and my brain is often bridged arbitrarily. The other dimension is the human brain and the animal brain, and cognition in things that don't have a brain, and whether there is such a thing. There was a big debate whether animals have foresight in animal psychology, and it's an interesting one. Because the conclusion is that as we learned about the brain, we concluded that animals have foresight, and that this is and we learned about how our brain functions relate to planning and so on. I think that one point I was trying to make is that the human health and human well-being is great, but we are facing a planetary crisis. So I think that the planetary health is a debate that should come into your community. The relationship is not, brain for humans is a good thing, but at some point humans begin to become really destructive in ways that damage a lot of other things. And this actually is an angle that somehow needs to come to your deliberations. Specific cases of reframing evidence, I don't know. The other thing is that the discussion with the public, we believe that foresight is relatively easy to discuss with the public. There's a lot of belief in that and little evidence. There are lots of small projects that appear to be successful. So it's an encouraging thing, but it's the beginning. Still, everybody has the problem of how to engage with society as a whole or with as broad publics as possible.
Right. Thank you very much for that reply. Now, Laura, may I ask you if you have a 1-minute comment to the panel
Yes.
presentation?
So as I was listening to this second round of input on the panelists, something that really kind of strikes me is also the need when we talk about responsible brain research and neurotechnology, is that we talk about it if it was just one thing, right? But there's so many types of neurotechnologies and so many areas of application, and sometimes we have to stop a little bit and really focus on which areas we want to really dive in and provide either public engagement or education opportunities or even guidance. And one of the reasons why I say this is because as part of the work we're doing in IEEE Brain, we have working groups that work, for example, with neurotechnology in the military space or neurotechnology that is used for the workplace or for education purposes. And some of the issues that are raised are similar, but some are somehow unique or at least more salient. So I think if we really want to push forward the conversation, having our discussions involving these nuances, I think would benefit from that.
Thank you very much, Laura, for your observation, which I think is very important. Now, I would like to open the floor to the audience. If there is a question, is there any question? I see no question on the screen, so maybe that gives me the luxury of being allowed to actually pose a question. There are so many to ask in the context. Maybe then I will focus on the term responsibility, since you have all said something about we need to know what we mean by the word we are using, be that neurotechnology or something else. The term responsible refers to social structures, and those are, of course, very differently conceived in different societies. Do we want to construct responsibility in a way that takes all of these different views into account? Or do we want to, we being this small community of European, American, and Canadian academics, which we call the international community, but it's really a minority of countries, or do we want to develop this, acknowledging that this is not global responsibility, but it is a kind of responsibility that we would like to see, and we would like to spread the word beyond our group? Or do we really want to try to take the other ideas into account, which may be uncomfortable? So does anyone have a view on that? Since there is no questions from the audience, I will get one person to respond, and I think that Caroline was first.
Was I first, Nikos? Or I couldn't tell whose hand went up first. Yes, Kathinka, I think it's such a wonderful question. And I know other panelists, including Nikos and Judy and others who have been working in the international arena, have thought a great deal about this question. I think some of my thoughts on it actually stem from some of our prior work when I was still at the Kavli Foundation in the Global Neuroethics Summit. And I know that both Judy and Laura had mentioned the importance of taking into consideration cross-cultural differences in thinking about human values, societal goals, and how critical it is to incorporate those in thinking about the ethical considerations of neuroscience. So there's that somewhat international component to it, and thinking really transnationally about developing principles or also guidelines for the kinds of questions that researchers could ask in the lab as they're performing their work. I think that one of the things that we've also learned is how critical it is to engage locally, as Judy mentioned as well, because I think that some of the lessons learned from local engagement, let's say even in specific patient groups on topics, because the usage of certain neurotechnologies or biologics in different patient groups can be so nuanced that there's a lot that can be learned even from the local setting, and some of those lessons can be scaled to other patient populations and other ethics questions that come up. So I think there's really an opportunity to go from both the sort of larger global perspective as well as the sort of bottom-up local perspective, and have those inform each other. That's just my thought on where we're at right now, is really focusing on the local aspect.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Caroline, for this. I here have a question for Pavel. Earlier on today, René von Schomburg talked about fears of privatization of research, and that being counterproductive to realizing social benefits of brain research. How do you see this in relation to Ebrains? Do you share his fear?
I don't necessarily share that fear, because we are active in the field of publicly funded research. I don't see an oversupply of private funders entering this field of deep understanding of the brain, right? Because we should probably make a distinction here between fundamental science and a flurry of activities that have less to do with fundamental science, to put it mildly. And when it comes to fundamental science, it's mostly public funders who are involved. And in fact, we need to collectively make the case for stronger involvement of public funding. I mean, we can see in Horizon Europe, for example, that there is a shift towards applied research. There is, of course, a certain logic to that. But when it comes to brain research in particular, you cannot avoid funding the understanding of the brain, because so much remains to be discovered in this field. The link between structure and function to start with, and therefore I don't have any concern over the pressure from the private funders when it comes to genuine, basic, fundamental science that is really needed for progress to be sustainable. Yes, there is a flurry of activity in the private domain, but that has often little to do with basic science.
Thank you, Pavel. Thank you very much. So there is a question to Judy here. I wonder if we could not and should not both focus on the relief of suffering at the same time as we engage with future visions of emerging neurotechnologies. Otherwise, don't we risk being too late in navigating emerging technologies responsibly? Judy, that was for you.
Oh, thank you. No, and that's a great question, and it just allows me to perhaps make my point more clearly than I made it before, which is that I don't think we should go away from thinking about the future. In fact, one of the foundations of neuroethics is to anticipate, is to think about the future. What I fear is that we go too far down the path of thinking about the future and leave problems that are already at hand behind. And so I think it's a question of balance. Today, I would still encourage that we devote more and continuing attention to the burden of diseases of the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. And I think there is a place for the futurists to be thinking and investing in the future. But I just want to caution that future thinking doesn't distract us from the problems of the present that are so enduring, that are so hard to solve. We still don't have a cure for Alzheimer's disease. We see brain diseases associated with COVID and so forth ever more acutely. So there is health and wellness to attend to first, and then alongside it, thinking about the future. Kathinka, if I just may make a quick point to Pavel's answer and to the question before, which is around privatization and so forth. We are doing some work now on intellectual property protection in both North American and European patents. And in the past 5 years or so, there have been about approximately 1,000 patents related to neurotechnology that have been filed. in Europe and in North America. There are most of them are methods and devices. But what's really important is that this trend, which is a bit flat compared to previous years, is actually now occurring alongside an open science movement. And I think what we're going to see is less interest in privatization and the patent arena and more engagement in the open science sector. And that will be a very interesting trend. And I think it'll give us new directions to think about in terms of ethical implications, in terms of responsibility, going back to your question, and so forth. So I give it now back to you.
Thank you. Yes, that is indeed a very, very interesting development. Certainly. Now we have sort of 1 minute left. Question to Laura now. What should we expect from the forthcoming IEEE Brain and Neuroethics framework, and when? And what is it you really want to add to the conversation?
Yes, thank you for that question. So we've been working for the past, I think, 2 years in this, what we call the Neuroethics framework, the IEEE Neuroethics framework. If you go already in the website, we have the scope for each of the different working groups, and it's been ongoing meetings with the different volunteers that we have that span a variety of disciplines, from engineers, disability studies, sociologists. So it has been fascinating to really engage with such a variety group of people. So we're hoping that this year we might launch the first, what I'm going to call the beta version, where people are gonna be opening it up for public input, so we can reiterate and improve, hopefully. And then parallel to that, what we just started late last year is we were approved to create the first socio-technical standard within IEEE Standard Association. So we just had our first meeting last month. And so again, I invite anyone that is interested to reach out to me or look at the IEEE Standard Association webpage. That's a long process to create a socio-technical standard, but I think it's an important one, given how at least most engineering communities and developers communities, how they manage to have this type of socio-technical standards. Again, kind of new word there is IEEE generally have been working with technical standards. They have worked with socio-technical standards for artificial intelligence. So again, the challenge of how do we're not reinventing the wheel, but really bringing something new to the conversation. So that's the challenge that we have, but we hope that in the next coming years, we can certainly bring something useful to the community. And then if I may, I just wanted to add something to the previous conversation about responsibility, which is that it's not only that, we focus on developing technologies, advanced science for the problems that we have, which is really, really important, but that we also thinking from an equity and social justice perspective, right? If we create very fancy new technology that only a few patients with Alzheimer's will ever be able to access, then we are not being responsible, right? I think we need to take about responsibility in ways that our advances are accessible and reachable to the populations that we want to serve.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that, Laura. Very, very briefly, since I see we have exactly 1 minute left, what do the panelists think are, if any, the ideas or social groups currently missing from the public discourse on neurogovernance? And what can we do to achieve greater inclusion? Is there any group missing? What can we do in that case? Caroline and Judy?
Yes, thank you, Kathinka. I think related as well to Laura's earlier point about social justice and equity, I think that there is a very deep need for greater representation of underrepresented minorities and groups in these discussions. And I think that in terms of what can we do, so this is the other aspect of Marcello's question to achieve greater inclusion. I think that in terms of responsibility, there is a responsibility on the part of institutions that support neuroscience or support science research. This can range from public and private funders to universities to even scientific journals to ensure that there is embedded inclusion of diverse perspectives in the work that they do. At the Dana Foundation, this is a major focus of ours in the work that we're funding, because we recognize that we can actually include this in our requests for proposals. How are different applicants thinking deeply about this beyond sort of some of the more boilerplate types of acknowledgements of diversity, equity, inclusion that might come with strategic plans and principles, but really how is this foresight for greater inclusion being baked into all aspects of the research process?
Thank you, Caroline. Now, I wish we could continue talking about that important issue and all the other important issues that have been raised, but we are regrettably out of time. So I wish to thank the panelists again very, very warmly for having joined us today, in spite of the ungodly hour for some of you. And thank you so much for your input. And if you could possibly write it, your key recommendations to us or in the chat, or that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
So we now reach the end of the day, where Lisa and Inga and I are going to sum up and give some impressions of this extraordinarily rich and rewarding, interesting day. How to begin, where to begin? Maybe I would begin then touching on the theme I was talking about before. Responsible research and innovation is clearly so very much more than ethics. Ethics is a key component, but it comprises also social science, philosophy, public engagement, and political knowledge, political awareness in application. So that, I think, is something that has not quite yet been applied in terms of research, in terms of funding. How do you agree with my impression?
Yes, I think very much. And in HPP, we have talked a lot over years how important that technology is not just technical, it's also political and social and cultural. And we really need all these different perspectives. And interestingly enough, over years, the most receptive audience for this message in the HPP I have found in HPP student community. In HPP, we have amazing interdisciplinary student community who meet regularly at the conferences and events. And there I see they are really engaged and interested to discuss what are political and social aspects of their research. So that adds to hopeful messages from this day. If we have this very engaged interdisciplinary student community who is so interested in the social and political aspects of neuroscience, that also means that the future might be bright, that when they become PIs, when they become leaders, they will think much more about these questions.
I share that impression totally, both from the HPP and from my teaching. I almost always come out greatly empowered, enthusiastic, and more hopeful about the future. So that was a very good point. What do you think, Lisa? Do you agree?
Yes, well, yeah, I think today has been incredible, first and foremost. But me personally, I've sort of pendulating. I feel also in our conversations between despair and hope. But one thing that I found really hopeful is that there's been this discussion about the future of responsible brain research beyond ethics. Like, ethics is an important component, but it's not the only component. One of the places where we might fall a little bit short is like looking for concrete places to support that additional component. But I've been very inspired and encouraged by the support that engagement with society, engagement with different publics, and also lay citizens have received. And they talk about not just consulting and participating, but actually also really being inclusive and being more mindful about who you engage with and who's actually entering into dialogue with the neuroscience community. And I think if that development could be made even stronger, and funders and policymakers could somehow also see the importance of this component and support it, then that would be my dream come true. Yeah.
Yes. But that has to take place in a social context. And so I think that in order to have responsible any science, not just brain science, but any kind of academic pursuit, it has to coincide or be developed alongside social responsibility in society at large. And we do not necessarily see that in every country in the world, to put it mildly. So maybe one should also ask scientists, philosophers, and everyone else concerned to become more aware, more socially aware, not just ethically aware, and politically aware in terms of gaining more knowledge about the political and social realities in which all of this, RRI, whatever else, is going to be applied. And not like a mantra saying beautiful words that finally mean nothing if they don't reach realization, but as a genuine ethical enlightenment, so to speak, if I may use a very old-fashioned word. So one needs to become more socially active, as in fact, looking back, as Judy said very wisely, we need to learn from, we need to look at the past. And certainly both scientists and philosophers were much more politically active in previous generations, going back in time, than we are today, for various reasons. But maybe that would also be positive. One works with society.
Yeah. And I think also it's really encouraging to see that there's, well, both within the Human Brain Project, but also like what Caroline Montojo mentioned, as the president for the Dana Foundation, how she really is supporting the educational element.
Yes.
And I wish that would, you know, that would inspire even broader, I think also maybe to some kind of different build-up of education in universities, for example, or even before universities, so that, you know, this interconnectedness of science with society would be something that was much more acknowledged and much more used for, developing science and technology.
Yes, we hear this every year when we go to HPP student conferences, young researchers events. There are always these very, very interested neuroscience students, computing students, and they say, yes, they haven't had any courses, any part of their education about these social and political aspects of science and technology, and they are very, very much interested, and that is clearly a need that has to be addressed.
Yeah.
Well, I think a responsibility that we have as organizers of this wonderful day, that I think we all learned a lot, is to try and analyze what we have heard, what people have said, and see if we can condense that somehow into a few key messages for ourselves and for whoever would be interested in hearing that. I think that would be a good thing to do.
Yes, we should definitely do that.
Yeah.
And whoever would be also able to lift that maybe into something concrete. So with that, perhaps we would thank everyone for today, all the speakers. That has been really, really amazing. The panelists, the audience. We've really enjoyed the day, and we hope you have, all of you as well. I don't think we have managed yet to wrap our heads around everything that's been said, so we will take some time to do that also after the conference today. But thank you, and have a good day and a good evening.